He expected a black-edged letter announcing her death. He had, after all, purchased a dying bride, a pale, coughing creature bartered by her own father to settle a ruinous gambling debt. He had sent her to the most desolate of his holdings, a place of rot and ruin called Morvain Hall, with the uncharitable and unspoken instruction to expire quietly and cause him no further trouble. He expected the damp chill of the place to finish what a lifetime of neglect and ill health had started. He did not expect, upon his own exhausted return from the cesspits of politics and war, to find the gates repaired, the chimneys breathing smoke, and the woman he had condemned to a quiet grave very much alive. He did not expect to find that she had not only survived but thrived, transforming his tomb into her fortress. And he certainly did not expect the single most staggering truth, that while he owned the decaying house, she, through a forgotten twist of fate and law, owned the very land upon which it stood, and upon which he was now, to his immense fury, trespassing. The solicitor's office was a study in shades of gray. Gray light filtered through the grimy panes of the tall window, illuminating swirling motes of dust that danced in the stagnant air. The walls were gray, the color of old dishwater, and the ledgers stacked high on every surface were bound in gray, scuffed leather. Even the man behind the desk, Mr. Pettigrew, seemed composed of gray matter. His suit, his thinning hair, his pallid skin. Alastair, the 9th Duke of Blackwood, felt the colorlessness of the room seep into the already hollowed-out spaces within him. It was a fitting backdrop for the business at hand, a transaction as devoid of warmth and life as the room itself. He had not wanted to be here. He had 1,000 other duties pressing in on him, matters of state and shadow that held the fate of nations in their delicate balance. A border dispute in the north, a trade agreement collapsing in the east, the ceaseless, venomous whispers of his political rivals in the capital. These were the things that occupied his mind. They were tangible problems, vast and complex, that could be met with strategy and force. They were the familiar demons he wrestled with daily. This, however, was something else entirely. This was messy, human, a distasteful domestic obligation he had inherited along with the title and the mountain of debts his father had so carelessly accrued. Across the wide mahogany desk, a battlefield of inkwells and sealed documents, sat Lord Ashworth and his daughter. The Baron was a man shrinking into his own finery, his coat too large for his diminished frame, his face a blotchy roadmap of fear and desperation. He could not meet Alastair's gaze, his eyes darting from the dusty corners of the room to the tips of his own trembling fingers. He was a man drowning, and he had just thrown his only child overboard to save himself. And then there was the daughter, Alara. Alastair had not bothered to learn her name until Pettigrew had announced them. She was as silent and still as a porcelain doll, her hands clasped tightly in the lap of a worn but clean gray dress that mirrored the room's bleak palette. He had been told she was sickly, and the description was accurate. There was a translucence to her skin, a fragile quality that suggested she might shatter if touched. Her face was pale, her features fine and sharp, dominated by eyes of startling, lucid gray that seemed to absorb all the limited light in the room. A shallow, persistent cough had rattled in her chest when she'd first entered, a sound like dry leaves skittering across pavement. She was, he concluded with the cold pragmatism that had become his shield, a poor investment. But the debt was considerable, and this was the only currency the Baron had left to offer. "The documents are in order, Your Grace," Pettigrew murmured, his voice a dry rustle. He pushed a sheaf of papers across the desk. The marriage contract, all clauses as discussed. Lord Ashworth's debts to the Blackwood estate are considered nullified upon the solemnization of the union. Alastair did not reach for the papers. His gaze remained fixed, not on the desperate father, but on the daughter. He was assessing her, the way a general assesses a piece of terrain, noting its weaknesses, its potential for collapse. He had seen men with more life in their eyes die on the fields of battle. She would not last the winter. The thought was not cruel, merely factual. It was, in a dark and practical way, the desired outcome. A dead wife was infinitely less complicated than a living one. A dead wife required no attention, no maintenance, no pretense of affection. She would be the Duchess of Blackwood for a few brief months, lending her soon-to-be-extinguished life to the settling of an account, and then she would be a name on a tombstone in a forgotten corner of a remote churchyard. And the other matter? Lord Ashworth's voice was a reedy thing, full of craven hope. Pettigrew cleared his throat. The bride's dowry, or lack thereof. He shot a nervous glance at Alastair. As we have established, there are no lands, no funds. The Ashworth holdings are forfeit. However, there is a small, unentailed parcel, a cottage, and some acres left to her late mother's line. Obscure but legally hers. It is offered as a gesture. Alastair waved a dismissive hand, the gesture sharp and final. He had no interest in some crumbling cottage. The gesture was meaningless, an empty formality. It is of no consequence. The arrangement is for the cancellation of the debt. Nothing more. His voice was low, resonant, the parade ground command he rarely used in civilian life, but the tone was unmistakable. It was the voice of a man for whom this entire affair was a footnote in a much larger, more important ledger. He finally looked at the woman, Elara, and for the first time, she met his gaze directly. There was no fear there, no pleading, no girlish hope for a reprieve. Her lucid gray eyes held a spark of something he could not immediately identify. It was not defiance, not exactly. It was colder than that. It was an unnerving, absolute clarity. It was the look of someone who had already seen the worst of the world and was entirely unimpressed by its latest offering. In that moment, she did not look like a victim. She looked like a survivor assessing a new, hostile environment. A faint, almost imperceptible tremor ran through her, and she brought a handkerchief to her lips, stifling another dry, racking cough. The moment of strength, if it had been that, was gone. She was once again the fragile, sickly creature he had paid for. "Is she well enough to travel?" he asked, the question directed at her father, but his eyes still on her. "Of course, Your Grace. A bit of a chill, nothing more. The country air will do her a world of good." The Baron blustered, his relief palpable. Alastair almost laughed. The air at Morvain Hall was not the restorative country air of pastoral poems. It was the damp, tomb-like breath of a dying thing, heavy with the scent of decay and perpetual rain. It would not do her a world of good. It would, with any luck, be the final push she needed to slip from the world, leaving him free. He stood, his tall frame casting a long shadow across the desk, eclipsing the lesser men in the room. "The ceremony will be this afternoon, at the chapel. A special license has been procured. Be there." It was not a request. He turned to leave, his mind already moving on, back to the maps and dispatches and the real wars that needed fighting. "Your Grace." The voice was quiet, but it cut through the room's gray fugue with the sharpness of glass. It was hers. Alastair paused, his hand on the doorknob, and turned his head slightly. Elara had not moved, but her chin was lifted. The handkerchief was gone from her lips. "You are purchasing a wife," she said, her voice raspy but clear, each word precisely enunciated. "May I know where my husband intends to store me?" The question was so blunt, so devoid of the expected feminine delicacy, that it took him a moment to process. "Store me like a piece of furniture, like a crate of unwanted cargo." The cynical accuracy of it was both galling and, in a strange way, respectable. He turned fully to face her. The spark was back in her eyes, a flicker of cold, hard flint. "You will be sent to Morvain Hall," he stated, his tone flat, offering no embellishment. He wanted her to understand the nature of her exile. "It is in the north. It is remote." A flicker of something, recognition, perhaps, crossed her features, but it was gone as quickly as it came. She simply nodded, a small, economical movement of her head. "I see. Thank you for the clarification." There was no more pleading, no more questions. She had her answer. She was a piece of property, and she had just been informed of her designated shelf. Alastair found himself strangely unsettled. He had expected tears, hysterics, a fainting spell. He had not expected this cool, brutal acceptance. He had not expected to be assessed and dismissed in turn by those unnerving gray eyes. He gave a curt nod to Pettigrew and swept from the room, the scent of old paper and desperation clinging to his coat. The transaction was complete. Now all that was left was the banishment. And then the waiting. The waiting for the black-edged letter that would finally close this sordid account. The carriage ride north was a long, silent penance. For 3 days, the world outside the leather-curtained windows dissolved into a smear of gray and green. The rhythmic drumming of the horses' hooves and the ceaseless creak of the carriage springs were the only sounds, a monotonous percussion marking their progress towards oblivion. Inside, the silence was a heavy, woolen blanket, thick with unspoken things. Alistair sat opposite her, his long legs braced against the carriage's sway, his gaze fixed on the world he was leaving behind. He had not spoken a single word to her since they had left the chapel, a cold, 5-minute affair witnessed only by a bored priest and a pair of damp-eyed crows on the leaded roof. Alara sat perfectly still, a small, straight-backed figure in the corner. She did not try to engage him in conversation. She did not weep. She did not complain about the cold that seeped through the floorboards or the bone-jarring lurch of the wheels over the rutted roads. She simply endured, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes, when he chanced to glance at her, fixed on the passing landscape. He wondered what she saw. Did she see the rolling hills and copses of trees, or did she see the bars of her prison cell drawing ever closer? He found himself watching her when he thought she wasn't looking. She was a puzzle he had no desire to solve, yet her quiet composure pricked at the edges of his carefully constructed indifference. She would occasionally be taken by a fit of coughing, a dry, hacking sound that seemed to tear at her fragile frame. During these episodes, she would turn her face to the window, pressing a white handkerchief to her lips, her shoulders shaking with the effort. But once the fit had passed, she would straighten her spine, fold the handkerchief neatly, and resume her silent vigil. There was a discipline in her suffering that he, a man who understood discipline above all else, could not help but notice. It was the discipline of a soldier, not a swooning maiden. On the 3rd day, the landscape began to change. The gentle hills gave way to stark, windswept moors. The trees grew stunted and bent, twisted into grotesque shapes by the relentless wind. The sky, which had been a uniform slate gray, now seemed to press down on them, heavy with the promise of a cold, miserable rain. The air itself tasted different, metallic and damp. They were entering his territory, the heart of the Blackwood lands. And Morvain was the blackest, most rotten part of that heart. He felt a grim satisfaction in the rising bleakness. This was the truth of the world he inhabited, stripped of the pretty lies of the capital. This was a land of hard realities and harsh consequences. Let her see it. Let her understand the nature of the grave he had chosen for her. Finally, the carriage slowed, turning off the main road onto a barely visible track. Overgrown branches, slick with moisture, scraped against the sides of the coach like skeletal fingers. The wheels sank into deep, muddy ruts, and the carriage pitched violently. Alistair instinctively braced himself, his body accustomed to rough travel. Across from him, Alara was thrown against the side of the carriage, her head striking the frame with a dull thud. For the first time, a sound escaped her lips, a small, sharp gasp of pain. He did not move to help her. He simply watched. He saw her press her fingers to her temple, her eyes squeezed shut. He saw the faint tremor in her hand, a flicker of something, pity, concern, stirred in the frozen depths of his chest, but he crushed it instantly. Pity was a weakness he could not afford. She was not his concern. She was a problem to be disposed of. After a moment, she opened her eyes. They were clouded with pain, but when they met his, they were as clear and steady as ever. She did not speak. She did not ask for comfort. She simply straightened her bonnet, smoothed her dress, and resumed her position, a queen reigning over a kingdom of one in a shaking wooden box. The carriage finally lurched to a halt. The coachman's voice, muffled by the rain that had finally begun to fall in earnest, called out, "We're here, Your Grace." Alistair pushed open the door, letting in a blast of cold, damp air that smelled of wet earth and decay. He stepped out into the mud, his boots sinking into the mire. Before him stood Morvain Hall. It was not a house. It was a carcass, a great, hulking skeleton of gray stone slicked with black moss and weeping green slime. Half the roof had collapsed, leaving a jagged, open wound to the sky. The windows were either boarded up or stared out like vacant, shattered eyes. The gardens that had once, perhaps a century ago, been a point of pride were now a tangled, thorny wilderness that clawed at the very foundations of the house, trying to drag it back into the earth. The entire place seemed to be slowly sinking into the sodden ground, surrendering to the inevitable victory of nature over man. It was a rotting tooth in the jawbone of the landscape. It was perfect. He turned back to the carriage. The coachman had opened her door and was fumbling with the small set of steps. Alistair waved him away. He had brought her this far. He would see the final act through himself. He reached the carriage door just as she was attempting to navigate the step. Her movements were slow, unsteady. The long journey, the blow to her head, the sheer oppressive misery of the place had clearly taken their toll. She looked smaller, more fragile than ever. A gust of wind whipped her cloak around her, and the rain began to fall harder, plastering loose strands of her dark hair to her pale cheeks. She looked up at the house, her face a mask of exhausted composure. He waited for the horror to register, for the tears to finally fall, for the accusations to begin. She said nothing. She simply took in the scene of absolute dereliction, her gray eyes moving from the collapsed roof to the choked gardens to the black, uninviting doorway. Her expression was unreadable. "The staff are expecting you," he said, his voice clipped. "A housekeeper, a groundsman. What's left of them." He knew the housekeeper, a sour-faced crone named Gable, would be no comfort. She had served his grim-faced grandfather and was as much a part of the house's decay as the damp in the walls. Alara's gaze shifted from the house to him. The rain was running down her face now, mingling with what could have been tears, but he knew were not. "You are not staying," she stated. It wasn't a question. "No," he confirmed. "I have duties in the capital." He was already thinking of the journey back, of the warmth of a fire, the taste of brandy, the familiar weight of his work. He had expected some sort of plea, a desperate cry not to be left alone in this godforsaken place. Instead, she gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "Of course. Your duties." There was a faint, ironic stress on the word duties that pricked his conscience like a thorn. He felt a sudden, sharp need to be gone, to put this place and this woman behind him. He had done what was required. The debt was settled. His part in this miserable farce was over. "Try not to be a nuisance," he said, the words harsher than he intended, born of his own discomfort. He turned his back on her, a small, solitary figure in the rain and mud, and strode towards the fresh set of horses that had been waiting for him. He did not look back. He did not want to see her standing there, a ghost already haunting the place of her own demise. He swung himself into the saddle, the leather cool and familiar beneath him. He gathered the reins, his movements sure and practiced. "Your Grace." Her voice again, not loud, but it carried on the wind, sharp and clear. He stilled his back to her, a muscle tightening in his jaw. "A word of advice," she called out. He waited, half expecting a curse, a final, desperate appeal. "Next time you mean to bury someone," she said, her voice steady despite the wind and rain, "it is customary to wait until they are actually dead." The sheer audacious insolence of it struck him like a physical blow. He slowly turned in his saddle to look at her. She was still standing by the carriage, her cloak whipped by the wind, her face pale, but her spine ramrod straight. She was looking not at him, but at the monstrous, decaying house. She was looking at it as a general looks at a battlefield, as a queen looks at a kingdom in disarray. Without another word, he spurred his horse, galloping away from Morvain Hall, away from the woman he had brought there to die. The sound of his horse's hooves was swallowed by the wind and the rain, but her words echoed in his mind, unsettling and persistent. He had left her there to perish quietly. But as he rode away, a single, unwelcome thought took root in his mind. This woman was not the type to do anything quietly. The room they gave her was a tomb within a tomb. It was vast, cold, and smelled of mildew and regret. A cavernous fireplace, its stone maw black with the soot of 1,000 forgotten fires, gaped at her, offering no warmth. The air was so damp she could taste it, a metallic chill on her tongue that seemed to come from the very stones of the house. A single, heavily draped window allowed only a sliver of the perpetual gray twilight to penetrate the gloom. The bed, a monstrous carved four-poster, was hung with threadbare velvet curtains that smelled of dust and spiders. When she lay down upon the lumpy, damp mattress, the cold seemed to rise up from it, a malevolent presence determined to leech the last of her warmth. She was a prisoner, not of the Duke, who had long since vanished back into his world of important men and important matters, but of her own failing body and the hostile house itself. The housekeeper, Mrs. Gable, was a creature as gray and crumbling as the manor. She was a woman made of pursed lips and disapproving silences. She brought Ilara thin, watery gruel on a tray, her expression clearly conveying her opinion that even this meager sustenance was a waste. She tended to Ilara not with care, but with a grim, dutiful resentment, as if she were merely laying out a corpse. The last one, she didn't last a fortnight. The old woman had rasped on the second day, her voice like stones grinding together. She was referring to the Duke's grandmother, a frail southern lady who had, according to local legend, withered away in this very room. The house didn't like her. Ilara, racked by a coughing fit that left her gasping for breath against the damp pillows, had simply stared back, her gray eyes burning in her pale face. The house didn't like her. It was a ridiculous, superstitious notion, yet as the days bled into a week, she began to understand. The house felt alive, and it felt malevolent. The drafts that snaked across the floor seemed to seek her out, to wrap their icy fingers around her ankles. The constant drip of water somewhere in the walls was a form of torture, a steady, maddening rhythm counting down the seconds of her life. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to deepen and writhe when she looked at them. The house was trying to kill her. It was finishing the job the Duke had started. She spent the first week in a feverish haze, drifting between a shallow, restless sleep and a waking state of utter misery. Her body ached, her lungs burned, and a profound, bone-deep weariness settled over her. This was it. This was the end her father had bartered for, the end the Duke had paid for. She was doing exactly what was expected of her. She was dying. The thought brought with it a strange, bleak sense of peace. There was no one to disappoint anymore, no one to fight for. The struggle was over. She could let go. She could close her eyes and let the cold take her. And then something shifted. It happened on the 8th day. The rain had momentarily ceased, and a single, defiant beam of watery sunlight pierced the grime on the window pane, striking the wall opposite her bed. It illuminated a patch of faded, peeling wallpaper. The pattern was of birds, small, delicate swallows, tangled in looping vines of ivy. Most were obscured by water stains and mildew, but in that one beam of light, a single bird was clear. It was poised for flight, its wings spread, its tiny form a perfect little study in freedom. Ilara stared at it. She stared at it for a long, long time. A swallow, a bird that builds its home from mud and spit, a tenacious, practical creature, a bird that travels thousands of miles, enduring storms and predators, simply to survive. It does not ask for permission. It does not wait for a more convenient season. It flies. She thought of her father's tear-streaked, terrified face. She thought of the Duke's cold, dismissive eyes. She thought of his parting words, laced with contempt. Try not to be a nuisance. She thought of his other words, the ones she had thrown back at him. Next time you mean to bury someone, it is customary to wait until they are actually dead. A fire, small but hot, kindled in the frozen landscape of her soul. It was rage. A pure, white-hot, magnificent rage. They had written her off. They had signed her death warrant, dug her grave, and tossed her in. And she, like a fool, had been obligingly pulling the dirt in on top of herself. No, the word was not spoken, but it screamed through her mind. No, she would not die in this damp, dark box. She would not be a footnote in the Duke of Blackwood's ledger. She would not give him the satisfaction of a black-edged letter. She would be a nuisance. She would be the most magnificent, inconvenient, and thoroughly alive nuisance he had ever had the misfortune to acquire. She pushed herself up, her limbs trembling with a mixture of weakness and newfound resolve. The room spun, and black spots danced before her eyes, but she held on, gripping the velvet bed hangings until her knuckles were white. She would not lie down again. To lie down was to surrender. When Mrs. Gable entered with the morning gruel, she found the bed empty. She stopped, her sour face contorted in surprise, the tray held aloft. Alara was standing by the window, wrapped in a threadbare dressing gown, her back to the door. She had been trying to work the latch, to force the window open, to let in the air, no matter how cold. "Get back to bed, Your Grace," the housekeeper snapped, recovering herself. "You'll catch your death." Alara turned slowly. The beam of sunlight was gone, but something of its light remained in her eyes. "I believe that was the intention, Mrs. Gable," she said, her voice a hoarse whisper. "But I have decided against it." She took a steadying breath. "You will move my things," she commanded. The housekeeper blinked. I beg your pardon. "You will move my belongings out of this mausoleum. Find me a smaller room, a drier room, one with a fireplace that draws and a window that opens. I don't care if it's a servant's quarter in the attic. I will not spend another night in this room." Mrs. Gable drew herself up, a lifetime of ingrained authority over a decaying household asserting itself. His Grace, the old Duke, he designated this the master's chamber. It is where the lady of the house resides. "The lady of the house is cold," Alara replied, her voice gaining strength. "The lady of the house is also, despite all evidence to the contrary, still breathing. And the lady of the house has just given you an order. Move." "Me?" For a long moment, the two women stared at each other. A battle of wills waged in the silent, damp air. The old, resentful order against a new, unexpected, and utterly defiant force. Alara did not blink. She held the housekeeper's gaze, pouring every last ounce of her will into that stare. Finally, with a sniff of profound disapproval, Mrs. Gable broke contact. She gave a stiff, jerky curtsy. "As you wish, Your Grace." It was a victory, a small, exhausting victory, but a victory nonetheless. It was the first stone she had dislodged from the wall of her own tomb. She had stopped acting like a dying woman and had started, however feebly, to act like a living one. The reclamation of Morvain Hall and of Alara, Duchess of Blackwood, had begun. The room she chose was in a forgotten wing of the house, a small parlor that had likely been a lady's private sitting room a generation or two ago. It was dusty and filled with furniture shrouded in white cloths, like a room full of ghosts. But it was on the south side of the house. Its fireplace was smaller and drew beautifully, and its windows, once she forced them open, looked out not on the tangled wilderness, but on the remains of a walled kitchen garden. It was still damp, still cold, but it was defensible. It was a start. Her first act, as the self-proclaimed living mistress of Morvain, was to declare war on the damp. With the help of the only other servant, a lanky, silent stable boy named Tom, she stripped the room. They hauled the ghost-shrouded furniture out into the hallway. They tore down the rotting curtains. She spent a full day on her hands and knees, scrubbing the mildew from the floorboards with a stiff brush and a bucket of vinegar she'd found in the pantry. The work was brutal, exhausting. Every muscle in her body screamed in protest, and her cough returned with a vengeance. But with every stroke of the brush, she felt a sliver of power return. She was not just cleaning a room. She was scouring away her own despair. Her second act was to find the ledgers. Mrs. Gable claimed to know nothing of them. "The master handles the accounts," she'd said, her tone implying that a woman, especially a sickly one, had no business with such things. Alara ignored her. She began a systematic search of the house, starting with the Duke's study. The room was a shrine to neglect, coated in a thick layer of dust, the air thick with the scent of cold ash and old paper. After 2 days of searching, she found them, tucked away in a locked cabinet behind a moldering tapestry. A huge, leather-bound book labeled Morvain Estate Accounts. She sat at the great, dusty desk, the ledger open before her, and for the first time since her arrival, she felt a flicker of something that was not rage or defiance, but cold, hard purpose. This was a language she understood. Before her father had gambled away their fortune, he had, in a rare moment of practical forethought, insisted she be educated in mathematics and household management. A woman must know how to run a house, he had declared, even if she has servants to do the running. It was an education she had thought useless for a bankrupt orphan. Now, it was her only weapon. The news the ledger told was bleak. Bleaker, even than the house itself. Morvain was not just neglected, it was bleeding out. Funds were allocated from the Blackwood estate, a generous sum, but they seemed to vanish into a black hole. She saw exorbitant payments to suppliers for goods that were nowhere in evidence. She saw wages for a dozen staff, though she had only met Mrs. Gable, Tom the stable boy, and a taciturn groundsman named Finch. She saw, in Mrs. Gable's spidery handwriting, requisitions for wine, for silks, for spices, for all manner of luxuries that had never graced the halls of this rotting pile. Mrs. Gable was not just a resentful servant. She was a thief. She had been systematically robbing the estate blind for years, assuming, correctly until now, that no one would ever come to check. The confrontation was short and brutal. Alara summoned the housekeeper to the study. She did not raise her voice. She simply sat behind the Duke's desk, the open ledger before her, and pointed to a line item. 4 barrels of French brandy, Mrs. Gable. Delivered last month. Where are they? The woman's sour face turned a mottled red, then a pasty white. She began to bluster, to deny, to accuse. Alara let her talk, her own silence a more powerful weapon than any shout. When the tirade finally sputtered out, Alara looked up, her gray eyes as cold and sharp as chips of flint. "You have been a loyal servant to this house, Mrs. Gable," she said, her voice quiet and even. "So loyal, in fact, that you have mistaken its assets for your own. You will pack your things. You will be gone by nightfall. If you are not, I will send Tom to the magistrate with this ledger. I am sure he will be very interested in your accounting methods." She had expected a fight. Instead, the old woman crumbled. The bluster and arrogance evaporated, leaving behind a terrified old woman facing the abyss. She pleaded, she begged, she wept. Alara felt a brief, sharp pang of something that might have been pity, but she crushed it. Pity was a luxury she could not afford. This house, this life was a battlefield, and Mrs. Gable was a casualty of the new regime. By nightfall, she was gone. The house felt instantly lighter, the air cleaner. The malevolent presence had not been the house itself, but the rot within it. With Mrs. Gable gone, Alara's takeover became absolute. She moved her base of operations from the small sitting room to the Duke's study. It was her war room. She pored over the ledgers, her fingers becoming permanently stained with ink. She was ruthless. She slashed expenses. She sent letters canceling the fraudulent orders. She began to board up the unused, unsalvageable wings of the house, consolidating their meager resources into the central, defensible core. The house began to shrink, to pull in on itself, becoming less of a rambling, decaying monstrosity and more of a tight, functional fortress. She sought out the groundsman, Finch. He was a man who seemed to be part of the landscape, his skin weathered like bark, his hands permanently stained with earth. He was wary of her at first, accustomed to being ignored. She did not give him orders. She asked him questions. What could be salvaged? What could grow here? Where was the well? He looked at her, this pale, slender woman in a patched dress, with her ink-stained fingers and her relentless, practical questions, and a flicker of something like respect entered his eyes. He showed her the collapsed kitchen garden, a space that had once fed the entire household. He showed her the broken sluice gate that had caused the lower fields to flood. He showed her the apple trees, choked with weeds but still alive. Together, they began to work. She, with her strategic mind, and he, with his deep, practical knowledge of the land. They cleared the garden, Finch turning the soil while she, on her hands and knees, pulled weeds until her back ached and her hands were raw. They planted hardy winter vegetables, kale, leeks, turnips. It was a small, defiant act of faith, planting seeds in the shadow of winter. It was during this time, while searching the library for any other estate documents, that she found it. Tucked inside a dusty volume of local history, she found a bundle of legal papers tied with a faded ribbon. They were old, written in the cramped, spidery script of a long-dead lawyer. They concerned a marriage settlement, that of her own grandmother. And within the dense, legalistic prose, she found the clause. The Ashworth lands of her grandmother's dowry had been absorbed into the Blackwood estate upon her marriage. All except one parcel. A parcel deemed too remote, too wild, too worthless to be formally incorporated. The land upon which Morvain Hall had later been built. Due to a bizarre legal quirk, an ancient entailment on her maternal side, the land itself had not been part of the sale or the dowry. It had remained in the maternal line, to be passed down to the eldest female heir. The deed was there, crisp and clear, bearing her mother's name, and now, by right of inheritance, hers. Alaris sat back in the dusty chair, the papers clutched in her hand, the enormity of it washing over her. The Duke of Blackwood owned the house. The stones, the timbers, the collapsing roof. But she, Alara, the bankrupt daughter, the sickly bride, the woman he had sent here to die, she owned the land. The ground beneath his feet, the moors, the fields, the choked gardens, the very soil in which his house was slowly sinking. A slow smile spread across her face. It was the first time she had smiled in months. It was not a happy smile. It was the smile of a general who has just discovered the enemy's secret weakness. The smile of a queen who has just found her crown, not made of gold and jewels, but of mud and stone and law. She was not a guest here. She was not a prisoner. She was the landlord. And the Duke, her husband, was nothing more than a tenant whose rent was about to come due. The transformation of Morvain Hall was not a miracle. It was a brutal, grinding, day-by-day battle against entropy. But slowly, inch by inch, she was winning. Smoke now rose consistently from one of the great chimneys, a sign of life visible for miles. The kitchen garden, under Finch's expert care and her relentless weeding, was a patch of vibrant green against the gray landscape. With Tom's help, she had managed to patch a section of the roof over the kitchens and her own rooms, using slates salvaged from the collapsing wings. The house began to breathe again. The scent of mildew was slowly being replaced by the smell of wood smoke, of baking bread, her own lumpy but edible creations, of drying herbs she had gathered with Finch from the moors. The house was no longer a tomb. It was becoming a home, a strange, battered, fiercely protected home. And she was its undisputed queen. She had faced down the ghosts of the past and the rot of the present, and she had won. Now, all she had to do was wait for the Duke to return. The thought no longer filled her with dread. It filled her with a strange, exhilarating anticipation. The next battle was coming, and this time she would be ready. Alistair rode through a landscape of ghosts. The war was over. Not the grand, glorious war of ballads, but the grubby, soul-corroding war of politics. He had spent 6 months in the capital, immersed in a miasma of intrigue, betrayal, and compromise. He had brokered a fragile peace, secured a vital trade route, and outmaneuvered his rivals. But the victories fell hollow, the successes coated in a film of grime. He was exhausted, not the simple, honest exhaustion of a soldier after a battle, but a deep, spiritual weariness that had settled in his bones. He felt hollowed out, a walking suit of armor with nothing inside. He had fled the city without a word to anyone, driven by a primal, inexplicable urge. He had told his aides he was inspecting his northern holdings, a plausible lie that would buy him a few weeks of solitude. But it was not solitude he sought. Not exactly. He was riding towards Morvain Hall. The decision baffled him. Why was he riding towards the one place on earth he had sworn to forget? Why was he seeking out the monument to his own cold pragmatism? He told himself he was simply curious. He was expecting a letter, a black-edged missive from the local vicar, informing him that his short-lived, inconvenient duchess had finally succumbed. The letter had never come. For 6 months, there had been only silence. A silence that was, in its own way, more unsettling than the news he had been expecting. Perhaps she had simply run away. It was a possibility. Fled the decaying house and her spectral existence. He found he did not like that thought. It implied a failure of his judgment, a miscalculation. He had chosen Morvain specifically for its inescapable bleakness. As he drew closer into the familiar, stark beauty of the moors, he prepared himself for what he would find. The house would be further decayed, perhaps even partially collapsed after the winter storms. The grounds would be a wilderness. He would find Mrs. Gable, who would tell him that the pale, sickly girl had withered away in a matter of weeks, a sad but predictable story. He would make the necessary arrangements for a quiet burial, pay the vicar, and ride away, the final loose end of his father's disastrous legacy finally tied up. He was composing the imaginary letter to her father in his head, a masterpiece of coolly expressed condolences. The first sign that something was wrong, or rather, not wrong in the way he had expected, was the gate. The great, rusted, wrought-iron gates of Morvain had been sagging on their hinges for a generation, permanently open a few feet, as if the house was too weary to either welcome visitors or repel them. Now they were closed and repaired. The rust had been scrubbed away from the hinges, which had been oiled. One of the bars, which had been broken for as long as he could remember, had been crudely but effectively welded back into place. He dismounted, his brows furrowed in confusion. He pushed the gate. It swung open smoothly, silently. It was a small thing, but it was profoundly, deeply wrong. It was a note of order in a symphony of chaos. He led his horse up the long, winding drive. The change was even more pronounced here. The overgrown branches that had scraped the sides of his carriage had been ruthlessly cut back. The worst of the ruts in the drive had been filled with gravel. And then he saw the trees. The ancient, half-dead oaks that lined the drive had been pruned. The dead would have been cut away, allowing the living branches to breathe. It was the work of someone who cared, someone who planned for the future. He felt a growing sense of unease, a prickling at the back of his neck. This was not the landscape of death he had been anticipating. This was the landscape of reclamation. And then he saw the house itself. He reined in his horse, his mouth slightly agape. From a distance, it was still the familiar, hulking beast of gray stone. But as he got closer, the details resolved themselves, and each one was a fresh shock to his system. The gaping wound in the roof over the west wing was still there, but the roof over the central part of the house, the core of the building, was whole. New slates, brighter than the old, moss-covered ones, were visible in neat rows. Several of the shattered windows on the ground floor had been boarded up, not with rotting planks, but with solid, well-fitted timber. And then he saw the smoke, not the thin, ghostly wisp of smoldering fire, but a thick, steady plume of gray smoke rising from one of the main chimneys. It was a defiant banner of domesticity, a declaration of life against the encroaching wilderness. It was the most shocking thing he had ever seen. He urged his horse forward, his heart pounding with a strange mixture of dread and a furious, unwilling curiosity. Who had done this? Had his instructions been ignored? Had some overzealous estate manager from his central office taken it upon himself to begin repairs? It seemed unlikely. He had made his intentions for Morvain, his desire for it to be left to rot, perfectly clear. He rounded the final bend in the drive and saw the kitchen garden. It was no longer a forgotten tangle of weeds and thorns. It was a neat, orderly grid of green. Rows of kale stood like proud soldiers, their dark leaves a vibrant splash of color against the gray stone of the wall. Leaks pushed their pale green shoots from the dark, turned earth. It was small, it was practical, it was undeniably, stubbornly alive. And standing in the middle of it, her back to him, was a woman. She was wearing a simple, patched brown dress, its hem stained with mud. A worn shawl was wrapped around her shoulders. Her dark hair was braided and coiled at the nape of her neck, but loose strands escaped, catching the pale afternoon light. She was leaning on a hoe, her posture one of weary satisfaction, as she surveyed her domain. Alistair's blood ran cold. He knew, with a sudden, sickening certainty, who it was. But it was impossible. The woman he had left here was a fragile, coughing wraith, a porcelain doll on the verge of shattering. This woman was solid, rooted to the earth. She was slender, yes, but there was a strength in the line of her back, a purpose in the way she held herself. He dismounted, his movements stiff, his mind reeling. He tethered his horse to a low-hanging branch and walked towards the garden gate, his boots making no sound on the soft earth. He felt like an intruder, a ghost haunting the edges of a world that had moved on without him. He reached the low stone wall that enclosed the garden. He was close enough now to see the details, to see the calloused, dirt-stained hands that rested on the handle of the hoe, to see the fine scratches on her forearms, to see the determined set of her jaw. He did not know what to say. What does one say to a ghost one has failed to exorcise? What does one say to a woman one has sentenced to death, only to find her tending her garden? He cleared his throat. The sound was unnaturally loud in the quiet air. She did not startle. She simply straightened up slowly, her movements deliberate, and turned to face him. It was her, Alara, but it was a version of her he had never seen. The 6 months of hard work and clean air had done what a lifetime of coddling and tonics never could. The translucence of her skin was gone, replaced by a healthy pallor, her cheeks touched with a faint flush from the cool air. The hollows beneath her eyes were less pronounced. She was still slender, but she was no longer fragile. There was a wiry strength to her now, the resilience of a sapling that has learned to bend in the wind. But it was her eyes that held him. They were the same lucid gray he remembered, but the brittle, defensive spark had been forged into a cool, steady flame. They held no fear, no surprise, only a calm, unnerving certainty. She looked magnificent. He stared at her, the carefully composed words of condolence dying on his lips, the political calculations and hollow victories of the past 6 months fading into insignificance. The world had tilted on its axis. He, the Duke of Blackwood, master of 1,000 strategies, was utterly, completely at a loss. Only one thought, blunt and stupid, could force its way through the fog of his shock. "You're alive," he said. The words came out as a hoarse accusation. Alara's lips curved into a small, tight smile. It was not a smile of welcome. It was the smile of a chess player who has just checkmated her opponent in 3 moves. She leaned the hoe against the wall, her movements unhurried, as if she had been expecting him all along. "I apologize for the inconvenience, Your Grace," she replied, her voice cool and clear as a winter stream. "I trust it will not upset your accounting too terribly." The confrontation he expected had been one of horror and decay. He had prepared himself for a tomb. He had not, in his wildest imaginations, prepared himself for her. He had come here seeking the silence of a grave, a final end to a messy obligation. Instead, he had found a queen in her garden, and the unnerving realization that the war he had thought won was, in fact, just beginning. He was an intruder in his own house, or what he had thought was his own house. The realization settled on Alistair with the cold, heavy weight of a shroud. In the 2 days since his arrival, he had been relegated to the status of a guest, and a not particularly welcome one at that. He had been given a room, clean and dry, but conspicuously small and far from the traditional master suites. He had been served meals, simple but hearty fare that tasted of the earth from the garden outside. He had been treated with a cool, impeccable courtesy that was more unnerving than open hostility. Alara was no longer the silent, spectral figure from the carriage. She was the undisputed ruler of this small, self-contained world, and she moved through it with an authority that was both absolute and understated. She was in constant motion, her days filled with 1,000 practical tasks. He saw her conferring with Finch the groundsman over a broken fence, her head bent close to his, their conversation a low murmur of equals. He saw her in the kitchen, her sleeves rolled up, her hands dusted with flour as she kneaded dough with a fierce, rhythmic intensity. He found her in the study, his study, where she had clearly taken up residence. The room was no longer a dusty tomb, but a functional office, the great desk cleared of its ancient clutter and covered instead with neat stacks of papers, a fresh inkwell, and the infamous ledger, which she consulted with the focus of a field marshal planning a campaign. The staff, what little of it there was, orbited her like planets around a sun. Their loyalty was absolute and entirely hers. When Alistair had attempted to give an order to Tom, the stable boy, a simple instruction about the care of his horse, the boy had looked at him with polite confusion and said, "I'll have to ask the Duchess, Your Grace Alistair, the Duke of Blackwood, whose orders could move armies and alter the course of treaties, had been countermanded by a stable boy on the authority of the woman he had sent here to die." The humiliation was a sharp, bitter pill. He tried to assert his authority, to reclaim his territory. It was a disaster. He strode into the study one morning, determined to reoccupy his seat of power. She was there, of course, a pen in her hand, a smudge of ink on her cheek. She looked up as he entered, her expression calm, questioning. "This is my study," he announced, the words sounding childish and petulant even to his own ears. "It is," she agreed, her tone neutral. "It has the best light, and the chimney draws properly. I had Finch clear it. There was a family of jackdaws nesting in it. They have been relocated." She gestured to a chair opposite the desk. "Did you require something, Your Grace?" She had offered him a seat in his own study, as if he were a petitioner seeking an audience. The sheer, breathtaking audacity of it left him momentarily speechless. He was the Duke. This was his house. These were his servants. And yet, every corner of the place, every interaction, screamed that he was the one who was out of place. He was a relic of a former regime, a ghost haunting a house that had come back to life without him. He tried a different tactic. He would audit her work, find the flaws in her amateurish attempts at estate management. "I wish to see the accounts," he demanded, striding over to the desk. "Of course," she said, without a flicker of hesitation. She pushed the great ledger across the polished wood towards him. "I believe you will find them in order. I have cross-referenced the last 5 years of expenditures against projected income and actual disbursements from the Blackwood Central accounts. There were discrepancies." He spent the next hour poring over the ledger. He had expected a mess, a jumble of feminine scribbles and nonsensical calculations. Instead, he found a work of cold, hard, logical genius. Her handwriting was neat, precise. The columns were perfectly aligned. She had methodically uncovered Mrs. Gable's years of theft, documenting every fraudulent charge, every missing barrel of wine. She had compiled a list of assets, salvageable timber from the collapsed wing, lead from the roof, a set of silver candlesticks she'd found in a locked chest, and assigned them a monetary value. She had created a budget, lean and brutal, that allocated every penny with ruthless efficiency. It was not just competent. It was brilliant. It was the work of a mind as pragmatic and unsentimental as his own. He looked up from the ledger, his head swimming. He felt a grudging, infuriating flicker of admiration. He had tried to bury a nuisance, and had instead unearthed a quartermaster. "Where did you learn to do this?" he asked, his voice rough. "My father, in one of his few moments of foresight, believed a woman should know how to manage a household's finances," she replied, her eyes not leaving the document she was reading. "He said it was to ensure she would not be cheated by the servants. He did not, I presume, anticipate it would be to prevent being cheated by her own husband's staff." The barb, delivered so calmly, struck home. He had abandoned her, left her to the mercy of a thieving housekeeper in a decaying house. He had not cared if she lived or died, only that she did so quietly. And in his absence, she had not only survived, She had single-handedly saved this estate from ruin. She had done his duty for him. The power struggle was not a struggle at all. It was a rout. He had no power here. His title, his name, his authority, they were meaningless currency in this kingdom of mud and stone. Here, the only currency was practicality, resilience, and hard work, and she was infinitely wealthier in those than he was. He found himself watching her, trying to understand the woman she had become. He saw her one afternoon, down on her knees in the garden, her face smudged with dirt, patiently showing Tom how to properly stake a row of beans. There was a quiet focus to her, a deep connection to the task at hand that he had only ever seen in soldiers cleaning their rifles after a battle. It was the focus of a survivor. Later that day, the sky, which had been threatening all afternoon, finally broke. A cold, driving autumn rain began to fall, turning the grounds into a sea of mud. He stood at the window of his small room, watching the deluge, a sense of grim satisfaction settling over him. This was the true nature of Morvain, the bleakness he knew and understood. The brief interlude of sunshine and order was over. The rot would return. He went down for dinner, expecting to find her subdued, defeated by the weather. Instead, the main hall was warmer and brighter than he had ever seen it. A massive fire roared in the hearth, a fire built from the deadwood she and Finch had cleared from the drive. The table was set for two, and the air smelled of roasting meat and herbs. She entered the room a few moments after him, her hair damp from the rain, her cheeks flushed. She was not defeated. She looked energized, invigorated. "A good storm," she commented, holding her hands out to the fire. "Finch says the rain barrels will be full by morning, and it will show us where the leaks are in the east corridor roof." He stared at her. She saw a storm not as a destructive force, but as a resource, an opportunity. She saw the world in a way he had forgotten how to. He saw enemies to be conquered, problems to be managed. She saw a garden to be tended, a house to be healed. That night, the storm intensified. The wind howled around the corners of the house like a hungry wolf, and the rain lashed against the window panes. Alistair lay in his bed, the sound of the storm a familiar lullaby. He had slept on battlefields with cannon fire for a serenade. A bit of wind and rain was nothing. But then, through the howling of the wind, he heard another sound, a sound that chilled him to the bone. A cough. It was a dry, hacking, desperate sound. The same sound he had heard in the carriage, but worse. It was deeper, more violent. It was the sound of lungs tearing themselves apart. It was coming from her room, down the hall. He lay there, frozen for a long moment. He told himself it was not his concern. She was resilient. She was strong. She would be fine. But the coughing continued, growing more frantic, punctuated by ragged, gasping breaths. It was the sound of a body failing. He thought of the men he had lost, the ones who had died in his arms, their breath rattling in their chests, the ones he could not save. The memory, sharp and unwelcome, rose in him like bile. Damn her. Damn her for being strong. Damn her for making him see her as a person. And damn her for being fragile, after all. With a curse, he threw back the blankets and got out of bed. He lit a candle, the flame flickering wildly in the drafts, and made his way down the dark, cold hallway towards the sound, towards the woman who was both his prisoner and his captor, towards the crisis he had unknowingly precipitated, and the one he was now, against all his instincts, compelled to face. The door to her room was slightly ajar. He pushed it open and stepped inside. The scene that greeted him was one of chaos. The calm, orderly world she had built around herself had shattered. Papers were scattered on the floor, knocked from the small table by her bedside. A pitcher of water lay on its side, a dark stain spreading across the floorboards. The fire in the hearth had burned down to a pile of glowing embers, offering little warmth against the chill that radiated from the stone walls. And Alara, she was huddled in the center of the bed, wrapped in a thin blanket, her body racked by violent, uncontrollable shudders. Her face, illuminated by the flickering candlelight, was pale as death, her lips tinged with blue. Her breath came in shallow, ragged gasps, each one a desperate, losing battle for air. The cough that had summoned him had subsided, replaced by a terrifying, wheezing silence. She was drowning, drowning in her own lungs. For a frozen second, he was back on the blood-soaked fields of the continent. He was kneeling over a young lieutenant, a boy with his mother's eyes, trying to staunch a wound in his chest, the boy's breath coming in the same ragged, liquid gasps. He had failed then. The memory was a scar on his soul, a failure he carried with him every day. The old, cold, pragmatic Duke would have turned around. He would have closed the door, gone back to his room, and waited for morning. He would have told himself it was inevitable. He had bought a dying bride, and she was merely fulfilling her part of the bargain. But the man standing in the doorway was not that Duke. Not anymore. She had, in the past few days, systematically dismantled that man, piece by piece, with her quiet competence and her infuriating resilience. She had shown him life in a place he had condemned to death, and he found, to his own profound shock, that he was not willing to let that life be extinguished. He moved. The paralysis broke, and years of military command took over. A crisis was a crisis. A battlefield was a battlefield. And his wife, his duchess, his tenant, his infuriating, magnificent adversary, was a casualty in desperate need of aid. "Tom," he roared, his voice a parade ground bellow that seemed to shake the very stones of the house. He knew the boys slept in a small room off the kitchens. "Finch, to me." He did not wait for them. He strode to the fireplace, grabbed the iron poker, and began to viciously stir the embers, throwing on the logs that lay in a basket beside it. Warmth. She needed warmth. He stripped the heavy velvet curtains from the window, the ones she had so despised, and piled them on her bed, tucking them around her shaking form. They were dusty and smelled of ages, but they were thick and they would hold in the heat. She flinched at his touch, her eyes, glazed with fever, fluttering open. She did not seem to recognize him. She was looking at a ghost from her own past, a figure of terror. "No," she whispered, her voice a threat of sound. "Please, not the cold room." She was delirious, trapped back in a tomb-like chamber where he had first abandoned her. The realization was a knife in his gut. This was his fault. She had worked herself to the brink of collapse, fighting against the decay he had imposed on her, and the first major storm had pushed her over the edge. Finch and Tom arrived, their eyes wide with alarm, pulling on shirts over their nightclothes. They stared at the Duke, this fearsome, half-dressed nobleman who had descended upon them like a thunderclap, and then at the Duchess, pale and still beneath a mountain of blankets. Alistair did not give them time to be afraid. He issued orders, his voice sharp and precise, the voice of a commander in the field. "Finch, more wood, and boil water, as much as you can. Tom, ride to the village. Find the apothecary. Tell him the Duchess of Blackwood is ill. Tell him I will pay him a year's income if he is here by dawn. Take my horse. Go." The two men, accustomed to taking their orders from the quiet, steady Duchess, were momentarily stunned by this whirlwind of masculine authority. But there was a certainty in his voice, a desperate urgency that compelled obedience. They scrambled to do his bidding. He was alone with her again. The fire was beginning to catch, its nascent light pushing back the shadows. He knelt by the bed, his hand going to her forehead. She was burning up. The fever was a raging inferno, her body's last, desperate attempt to fight the infection in her lungs. He needed to get the fever down, but he also needed to keep her warm. It was a contradiction, a tactical problem he did not know how to solve. He thought back, dredging up memories of battlefield medics and camp surgeons. Fevers were fought with cool cloths. Chills were fought with warmth. She had both. Finch returned, his arms laden with logs, which he piled by the hearth. He was followed by a stout, red-faced woman Alistair had never seen before, who curtsied nervously. "Begging your pardon, your grace. I'm Finch's wife, Mary. I help the Duchess in the kitchens sometimes." "Good." Alistair snapped, relieved. "A woman would know what to do. She's burning with fever, but she's chilled to the bone." Mary Finch's practical, motherly nature took over. She felt Alara's forehead, her brow furrowing with concern. "It's the lung fever," she said, her voice grim. My mother had it. We need to keep her warm, Your Grace. And we need to get her to sweat the fever out. She looked at the Duke, her gaze direct. And we need to get that wet dress off her. Alistair froze. Of course. She had come in from the rain. In her exhaustion, she had likely collapsed into bed without changing. He, in his blind panic, had simply piled more blankets on top of her damp clothes, trapping the cold and wet against her skin. He had made it worse. He felt a flush of shame, of utter incompetence. He, the great Duke, the master strategist, was a clumsy, ignorant fool in a sick room. Right? He said, his voice rough. He turned his back, affording them a clumsy, aristocratic attempt at privacy. See to it. He stood by the fire, feeding logs into the flames, listening to the quiet, efficient sounds behind him. The rustle of cloth, Mary's soothing murmurs, the clink of a basin. He felt useless. He could command armies, but he could not fight the invisible enemy that was consuming his wife. All he could do was stand guard and feed the fire. When he turned back, Mary had worked a quiet miracle. Alara was now dressed in a clean, dry nightgown, her damp hair toweled and spread out on the pillow. She was still shivering, but the violent, body-racking shudders had subsided. We need to get some broth into her, Your Grace, Mary said, and willow bark tea for the fever. Finch is boiling the water now. For the rest of the night, the three of them worked as a team, a strange, ad hoc unit united by a single purpose. Finch kept the fire roaring and the water boiling. Mary brewed teas and broths, her movements calm and sure. And Alistair became the nurse. It was the most intimate and terrifying work he had ever done. He sat by her bed, and when Mary told him to, he would lift Alara's head, cradling the back of her neck with his large, ungentle hand, while Mary spooned warm broth or bitter tea between her lips. Most of it dribbled down her chin, but some of it went in. He held her hand, which felt small and fragile in his, its heat a terrifying, palpable thing. He wiped her brow with a cool, damp cloth, his movements clumsy at first, then more certain. He spoke to her, not knowing if she could hear him, his voice a low, steady murmur. He did not speak of politics or war. He spoke of his horse. He described the view from the battlements of his ancestral home. He told her about the jackdaws she had evicted from the chimney. He talked about anything and everything, filling the space around her with the sound of his voice, a human anchor in the stormy sea of her fever. Sometime before dawn, she began to thrash, her head tossing back and forth on the pillow, her hands plucking at the blankets. She was fighting unseen enemies, her whispers a jumbled mix of his name and her father's, of ledgers and cold rooms and dying birds. He captured her hands in his, holding them firm. "Hush now," he said, his voice softer than he had ever heard it be. "Hush. You are safe. I am here." He was not sure who he was reassuring, her or himself. As the first gray light of dawn filtered through the window, Tom returned, his face spattered with mud, his body drooping with exhaustion. Behind him was the apothecary, a small, fussy man with a bag full of bottles and a perpetually worried expression. The apothecary examined her, his touch professional and remote. He listened to her chest with a brass ear trumpet. He peered in her eyes. He toothed and shook his head. "A severe inflammation of the lungs, Your Grace," he pronounced, his voice grave, compounded by exhaustion. "She's a fighter, this one, but it will be a near thing." He left a bottle of dark, foul-smelling laudanum and a list of instructions. "Keep her warm. Keep her hydrated. Pray." Alistair paid him the promised sum without a word, his eyes never leaving Alara's face. The crisis had passed its initial, frantic peak, but the battle was far from over. The next few days were a blur of long, quiet hours by her bedside. The storm outside passed, but the storm inside her raged on. Mary Finch had to return to her own family, leaving Alistair in a rotating, silent watch from her husband. But mostly it was just him. He learned the rhythms of the sick room. He learned to read the subtle shifts in her breathing, to know when the fever was rising by the flush on her cheeks. He learned to change the linens on the bed while she was still in it, a feat of logistics and brute strength that left him sweating. He, the Duke of Blackwood, who had not so much as poured his own tea in 20 years, learned to make broth and brew willow bark tea. He learned to be patient. He learned to wait. And in the long, quiet hours, as he watched her fight for every breath, a profound and terrifying transformation took place within him. The cold, pragmatic shell he had built around himself for years cracked and fell away, shattered by the simple, profound act of caring for another human being. The debt, the contract, the inconvenience, all of it burned away in the fever heat of that room. She was not a commodity. She was not a nuisance. She was Alara. She was his wife. And he realized, with a clarity that was both terrifying and liberating, that he did not want her to die. He wanted her to live. He wanted her to wake up and argue with him over ledgers and look at him with those cool, gray, magnificent eyes. On the third night, the fever broke. He was dozing in a chair by the bed, his head slumped on his chest, when a small sound woke him. He looked up. Her eyes were open, and they were clear. She looked at him, her gaze taking in his unshaven jaw, his rumpled clothes, the exhaustion etched into his face. She looked at the tidy room, the roaring fire, the cup of cold tea on the bedside table. Her lips, still cracked and pale, moved. Her voice was a mere whisper, a dry rustle of sound. "You look terrible, Your Grace," she said. Alistair stared at her for a long moment, and then, for the first time in years, he threw back his head and laughed. It was a raw, rusty, unfamiliar sound, but it was a laugh nonetheless. The shared crisis had passed. The aftermath was about to begin. The quiet of the house in the days following the fever was a new kind of silence. It was not the hostile, decaying silence he had first found, nor the tense, combative silence that had followed his arrival. It was a gentle, convalescent quiet, punctuated by the crackle of the fire, the distant chop of Finch's axe, and the soft clink of a spoon against a bowl. Alara was weak, but she was alive. The house and its inhabitants seemed to be holding their collective breath, giving her space to heal. Alistair found himself in a strange, unscripted role. He was no longer the Duke, nor was he the frantic, desperate nurse. He was simply there. He had intended to leave the moment she was out of danger, to hand her care back over to Mary Finch and retreat to the safety of his own cold detachment. But he did not leave. He found he could not. The thought of returning to his world of political maneuvering and hollow duties felt obscene after the raw, elemental struggle he had just witnessed. He became the guardian of her convalescence. He moved a comfortable armchair into her room, now indisputably her room, the center of the household, and spent his days reading. He read aloud to her at first, from a dry book of Roman history he'd found in the library, his voice a low, monotonous drone that seemed to soothe her. He brought her meals himself, simple trays of broth and toast, and sat with her while she ate, her appetite slowly, painstakingly returning. These are not romantic gestures. There was no poetry, no tender sentiment. It was all intensely, awkwardly practical. He was there to ensure she did not try to get out of bed too soon. He was there to make sure she finished her broth. He was there, he told himself, because he had invested too much effort in keeping her alive to have her suffer a relapse through her own stubbornness. One afternoon, she was sitting propped up against a mountain of pillows, her color beginning to return, her hair neatly braided. She was staring at the ledger, which he had, against his better judgment, allowed her to have on the bed beside her. She was not strong enough to write, but her fingers traced the columns of numbers as if they were a familiar, comforting landscape. "The West Wing accounts are a disaster," she said, her voice still weak but with a hint of its old, crisp authority. "The timber salvage figures don't add up. Finch is too honest to be a good negotiator." Alistair, sitting in his chair by the fire, looked up from his book. A week ago, this would have been the opening for a power struggle, a challenge to his authority. Now it sounded like something else, an invitation. "He's a groundsman, not a merchant," Alistair replied, closing his book. He got up and walked over to the bed. He looked down at the ledger, at the neat columns of her handwriting and the spidery scrawl of the timber merchant from the local village. He's letting them take the best oak for the price of firewood. I know, she said, a flicker of frustration in her eyes. I was going to handle it myself. Before the storm. Before the fever. Before she had been reminded of the fragility of her own body. For the first time, he saw a crack in her magnificent armor. She had built this fortress, but she could not defend every wall by herself. He saw not weakness, but the simple, honest limits of a single human being. "Show me the contract," he said. She looked up at him, her gray eyes searching his face. She was wary, expecting him to take over, to usurp the authority she had fought so hard to win. He did not take the ledger from her. He simply stood there, waiting. After a long moment, she tapped a finger on a page. "Here." He's agreed to a price per cord, but there's no distinction made between seasoned oak and green pine, or the lead from the roof flashing. He's stealing from us. Alistair leaned over, his shoulder almost brushing hers, to look at the document. The faint, clean scent of soap and willow bark rose from her. He was intensely aware of her proximity, of the warmth emanating from her, a warmth that had nothing to do with fever. "This is not a contract," he said, his voice low. "This is a letter of invitation to thieves." A slow, cold anger began to build in him. Not at her, but the petty merchants and tradesmen who saw her, a lone woman, as an easy mark. They were vultures, circling her small, hard-won kingdom. "I know," she repeated, her voice quiet. "I will handle it," he said. It was not a question. The next morning, he rode into the village. He did not go as a concerned husband. He went as the Duke of Blackwood. He wore his finest riding coat, his boots polished to a mirror sheen. He did not shout or make threats. He visited the timber merchant in his small, dusty office. He sat down, placed the flawed contract on the desk between them, and began to speak. His voice was quiet, reasonable, and utterly terrifying. He spoke of the laws of contract, of the responsibilities of his title, of the historical precedents for dealing with those who attempted to defraud the Blackwood estate. He did not mention his wife. He did not need to. By the time he left, an hour later, he had a new contract, one that paid triple the price for the oak and the merchant's profuse, sweating apologies. He returned to Morvain that afternoon and went straight to her room. She was sitting by the window now, wrapped in a thick shawl, a book at her lap. He placed the new contract on the small table beside her. She picked it up and read it, her expression unreadable. She read it twice. Then she looked up at him. "You are a ruthless man, your grace," she said. "I am a duke," he replied. It is the first requirement of the job. He had used his power, the power of his name and his title, not for himself, but for her, to protect her work, to defend her kingdom. The feeling it gave him was more satisfying than any political victory he had ever won. A new dynamic began to form between them in the days that followed. A partnership. It was unspoken, unacknowledged, but it was there. She was the strategist, the planner, the head. He was the enforcer, the public face, the muscle. She would identify a problem in her ledgers, a supplier overcharging, a tenant in arrears, and she would discuss it with him. She would lay out the facts, the numbers, the desired outcome. He would listen, ask a few clarifying questions, and then he would ride out and execute the plan. They were a team. The silence between them changed, too. It was no longer a weapon or a void. It became a comfortable, shared space. He would sit for hours in her room, reading, while she worked on her accounts, the only sounds the scratch of her pen and the rustle of his pages. There was no need to talk. The work they were doing together was its own form of communication. One evening, he came into the room to find her standing, unsteadily, by the fireplace. She had been out of bed for the first time, a short, exhausting walk down the corridor and back. She was pale and trembling, leaning heavily on the mantelpiece. He moved to help her, to guide her back to the safety of her chair. "No," she said, holding up a hand. "I need to do this myself." He stopped. He understood. This was not about walking. This was about reclaiming her strength, her independence. So he stood back and watched, his body tensed, ready to catch her if she fell. She took a slow, shuffling step, then another. Her hand was outstretched, reaching for the back of her chair. She was not going to make it. Her knees buckled, and she began to sway. He lunged forward, his arms closing around her waist, catching her before she could fall. She was light, so light in his arms. Her head fell against his chest, and she let out a long, shuddering sigh of exhaustion and frustration. "I hate this," she whispered, her voice muffled against his coat. "I hate being weak." "You are not weak," he said, his voice rough, his arms tightening around her. "You are recovering. There is a difference." She did not answer. She simply stood there, leaning against him, her body pliant and yielding in his embrace. It was not a romantic clinch. It was something far more elemental. It was the simple, profound act of one human being supporting another. Her hands came up to rest on his chest, not to push him away, but to steady herself. He could feel the faint, steady beat of her heart against his palm. They stood like that for a long time in the warm, fire-lit room, while the autumn wind blew outside. The Duke and his Duchess, the soldier and the strategist, two lonely, damaged people who had, through a shared crisis and a common purpose, stumbled into a fragile, unspoken truce. He was holding her, anchoring her, and he realized, with a sudden, startling clarity, that she was doing the same for him. In the quiet, decaying heart of Morvain Hall, they had, against all odds, begun to build a partnership, and it felt terrifyingly like the foundation of something more. The call of the old world arrived on a Tuesday, carried by a man on a half-dead horse. He was a royal courier, his uniform splattered with mud, his face etched with the urgency of his mission. He had ridden non-stop from the capital, bearing a dispatch sealed with the king's own signet. Alistair met him in the courtyard, the crisp autumn air suddenly feeling colder, thinner. The sight of the royal crest was a physical blow, a summons from a life he had almost managed to forget. He broke the seal and read the letter, his face hardening into the familiar granite mask of the Duke of Blackwood. It was a crisis, of course. It was always a crisis. The fragile peace he had brokered was threatening to unravel. A key minister had been implicated in a scandal. His rivals were circling. The king, in his spidery, demanding script, did not request his presence. He commanded it. He was needed. His intellect, his ruthlessness, his reputation. He was the crown's weapon, and he was being called from his scabbard. He stood in the courtyard for a long time after the courier had gone, the parchment growing limp in his hand. The wind whipped at his coat, carrying the scent of wood smoke and damp earth, the scent of Morvain, the scent of his new reality. He looked at the house, at the steady plume of smoke rising from the chimney, at the neat patch of green that was the garden. This was real, the solid, tangible world he had helped to build and defend. The letter in his hand felt like a missive from a dream, a chaotic, exhausting, and ultimately meaningless nightmare. He went inside, his boots echoing on the stone flags. He found Alara in the study, where she always was. She had graduated from her sick room, and now commanded her kingdom from the great desk. She was stronger now, the last of the fever's shadows gone from her eyes. She wore a simple dark wool dress, practical and unadorned, but she wore it like a queen wears her coronation robes. She looked up as he entered, and she knew immediately. He did not have to say a word. She saw the letter in his hand, the grim set of his jaw, the familiar, distant look in his eyes. It was the look he'd had when he abandoned her here months ago. The look of the Duke of Blackwood, his mind already on other, more important matters. Her own face shuddered. The warmth and nascent trust that had grown between them in the quiet weeks of her recovery vanished, replaced by a cool, polite mask. The wall she had so painstakingly lowered went back up, instantly. She was once again the pragmatic survivor, bracing for abandonment. "You will be leaving, I presume," she said, her voice perfectly level. It was not a question. She turned back to her ledger, her pen hovering over a column of figures, a clear dismissal. She was already adjusting to his absence, recalculating the balance of her world. "The king has summoned me," he said, the words feeling like a betrayal. "The king's needs are, of course, paramount," she replied, her voice laced with a faint, icy irony. She still did not look at him. "You have duties. We have established this." She was throwing his own words, his own cold pragmatism, back in his face. She was making it easy for him. She was giving him the clean break he had not given her. He stood there, watching the straight, proud line of her back, and felt a chasm open up at his feet. It was the chasm between two worlds. One world was the world of kings and politics, of power and duty, the world he had been born and bred for. It was a world of grand, abstract concepts, honor, loyalty, the good of the realm. The other world was this room. It was the scent of beeswax and old paper, the scratch of her pen, the solid weight of the new contract on the timber. It was the memory of her head on his chest, the feel of her small, warm hand in his. It was a world of small, tangible things. It was a world that felt, to his profound astonishment, infinitely more real. He thought of the capital, of the endless, exhausting game. He would go back. He would win. He would fix it. And what then? Another crisis would follow. Another summons. He would spend the rest of his life patching the crumbling edifice of the state, a lonely, hollow man in a suit of armor, until he was too old and tired to fight anymore. He looked at Alara. She had taken a pile of rocks and weeds and built a fortress. She had taken a dying house and breathed life into it. She had taken his cold, brutal transaction and forged it into something real. She had not been patching a crumbling edifice. She had been building a foundation. He had come to Morvain seeking a grave, a quiet end to a problem. He had found, instead, the only thing that felt like a beginning. "No," he said. The word hung in the air between them. Alara stilled, her pen frozen mid-stroke. Slowly, she turned to look at him, her eyes wide with a confusion that broke through her carefully constructed composure. "No," she repeated, her voice a whisper. He walked over to the fireplace, where a low fire burned. He looked at the king's letter in his hand, at the arrogant loops of the royal signature, at the seal of power. He had lived his entire life in service to this symbol. He had sacrificed his youth, his peace, his humanity for it. And he was done. With a deliberate, decisive movement, he tossed the letter into the fire. Alara gasped. They both watched as the parchment curled, blackened, and was consumed by the flames. The king's command, the crisis of state, the call of his old life, all of it turning to gray ash and smoke. It was an act of treason, an act of liberation. He turned from the fire to face her. The mask of the Duke was gone, burned away with the letter. He was just a man, a tired, scarred man who had finally, after a lifetime of wandering, found his way home. "My duty was to the crown," he said, his voice raw with a new, terrifying honesty. "It was a duty I inherited, a duty I never questioned." He took a step towards her, then another, until he was standing before her desk. "I was wrong. My duty is not to a king who sits on a throne 1,000 miles away. It is not to a group of whispering, backstabbing politicians. It is not to the abstract concept of a nation." He reached across the desk, his hand covering hers where it rested on the ledger. Her skin was cool, and he could feel a faint tremor run through her. "My duty," he said, his voice dropping, his gaze holding hers, "is here, to this land, to this house, to the woman who saved it when I tried to condemn it." He saw the tears well in her eyes then, the bright, shocking tears of a woman who never cried. She was not weeping from sadness or relief. She was weeping from the sheer, overwhelming shock of it. The walls she had built to protect herself from him, from the world, were crumbling, washed away by this impossible, unbelievable declaration. "You are my home, Alara," he said, the words simple, direct, and more true than any oath he had ever sworn. "I was a ghost until I came back and found you here, so terribly, magnificently alive. Do not send me away." She pulled her hand from under his, but it was not to push him away. She stood up, her chair scraping back on the floorboards, and came around the desk. She stood before him, so close he could see the flecks of silver in her gray eyes, the faint scar on her temple from her fall in the carriage. She reached up and touched his face, her fingers tracing the line of his unshaven jaw. Her touch was hesitant at first, then firm. It was a touch of assessment, of verification, a touch that was making sure he was real. Alistair, she said, his name a quiet revelation on her lips. He had abandoned her. He had sentenced her to death. He had returned and tried to usurp her. And she had fought him, healed him, and partnered with him. She had seen the worst of him, the very worst, and she was still standing here. He lowered his head and kissed her. It was not a kiss of passion, not a kiss of romance. It was a kiss of sealing a contract, a true one this time. It was a kiss of homecoming. It was quiet, and it was certain, and it tasted of wood smoke and tears and the promise of a long, cold winter they would face together. When he lifted his head, she was not crying anymore. Her face was luminous. She leaned her forehead against his chest, her hands clutching the front of his coat, holding on as if she was afraid he might still vanish. "The winter will be hard," she whispered against his heart. "The roof on the east wing will not hold." He wrapped his arms around her, holding her tight, his chin resting on the top of her head. He was home. He was finally, truly home. "Then we will fix it," he said. Together. Outside, the first snowflakes of winter began to fall, dusting the moors in a blanket of white. But inside the walls of Morvain Hall, in the heart of the fortress they had built, two scarred and stubborn souls stood as one, a permanent fixture against the storm, in a house that was no longer a tomb, but a place fiercely, completely, and utterly alive.